If I asked you to picture a building from ancient Greece or Rome, you'd probably picture something with columns. That's how essential they are to the language of ancient architecture. And we still use them today whenever we're trying to exert power or authority, like in houses of government, banks, museums, places of worship, Weatherspoons. But there's more to these beauties than meets the eye, so join me as we dive into the colourful cabal that is the world of columns. Generally, we say there are three types, or orders, of classical Greek column. The first of these is the Doric, a very simple type with no base and the most basic capital. That's the bit at the top, although it usually at least has fluting. It likely had its roots in tree trunks turned vertically to provide a supporting structure for larger roofs. Above each column there would be a triglyph, which would reflect the wooden beams of the original temples. Next came the iconic Ionic column. Vitruvius, a Roman author who wrote a treatise on architecture, says that these columns were modelled on women on account of having flowing hair, the curled volutes of the column capital. This is unlikely to be the actual origin, and it's just a more adorned version of the Doric. The third main type of column was the Corinthian. This was the most ornate, flowing with acanthus leaves. Vitruvius again tells an interesting story of a sculpture inspired by a basket through the bottom of which an acanthus tree had grown. But these three orders were far from the first columns and far from the last. We'll get to the additions made by the Romans in a moment, but first we should understand that the classical columns built on a pre-existing architectural tradition. In the Bronze Age, the Minoan and Mycenaean people had a distinct type of column. This would get much wider towards the top, had no fluting, and a simple capital. These were found in Knossos, but evidence of their use is present at other sites, such as Mycenaean. And of course, different cultures create columns in different ways. The Egyptians had a great variety of column types, such as those based on leaves of palm trees or papyrus, inspired by the natural world. These could be covered in images and hieroglyphs rather than fluting. The Persians to the east had their own types too, and again we see the inspiration from natural foliage. And many featured ornately carved animals on top, such as bulls and lions. But coming back to the classical, the Greeks weren't the last word in columns either. The architecture of the Romans largely adopted the Greek model with two main additions. Firstly, the traditional architecture of the Etruscans, the native Italian people from whom the Romans took most of their culture, had an even simpler type than the Doric column. The Tuscan order was an unfluted column. It had smooth sides, with the proportions of an Ionic column and a simple Doric capital. Later on, under the early empire, the Romans developed a composite order, which featured a column combining the volutes of the Ionic with the leafy foliage of the Corinthian. Not a major departure, but an even more elaborate type of column for their grand imperial ambitions. The Romans did not consider either of these a formal type of order. Vitruvius, in his great treatise on architecture, doesn't mention either one. They are, after all, just variations on already existing Greek designs. You can see the many orders working together in various buildings, ancient and modern. The Bodleian Library in Oxford deliberately uses all five of these orders, becoming increasingly elaborate as it gets higher. Tuscan, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, Composite. In the ancient world, they could also be grouped. The Library of Celsus in Ephesus combined Corinthian with the more elaborate Composite. Where several rows were needed, such as the Colosseum, all three classical Greek orders could be used together: Doric, Ionic, Corinthian. But if we peek closely at the Colosseum, you might see at the very top a fourth story, with yet another type of column, or rather a different way of portraying a column. Pilaster columns could be described as a two-dimensional representation of a column, like the column has been flattened into the wall space. It's a step above just painting a column on, but can be used where actual columns would be impractical, expensive, or not provide enough support. Between a pilaster column and a regular column are engaged columns, also known as semi-engaged columns. These join the wall space to provide additional support, and are relatively common in Rome. Columns do not, however, have to be quite so functional. In fact, they are one of the most impressive decorative elements. Just look at the colossal columns of coloured marble from the Roman Forum and Augustan Forum. It's no surprise then that even more decorative forms exist, perhaps the most famous being the caryatids of the Erechtheion. These 6 columns, now 5 as one was nicked by Lord Elgin for the British Museum, took the form of women, with elaborate hairstyles and decorative clothing. Each one is unique, with a different face, pose, hairstyle. Vitruvius says that the women of Caryae near Sparta were punished with slavery for supporting the Persians. These columns represented that. However, this seems unlikely, as caryatid columns existed before the Persian Wars, such as the Scythian treasury. Male versions of these also existed, called Atlantes, after the Titan Atlas who held up the sky in Greek myth. A final and very late addition to these types was the Solomonic, or barley sugar column. These interesting columns swirl in a helix to create something very new. Probably the earliest of these were brought to Rome in the donations of Constantine in the 4th century. Not as common as the other types, in part because of how late these arrive on the scene, they are perhaps the most distinct and striking type of column. However, why stop at making the column just part of your structure, when it could be the whole thing? Monumental columns got rid of everything else to create a single commemorative pillar. These come in an array of styles and sizes. The earliest, of course, being the obelisks of Egypt, which the Romans could not resist appropriating for themselves. If we are willing to grant that obelisks are a form of column, despite being neither cylindrical nor used for a structural purpose, then it opens the door to many other things we could also consider columns. Perhaps the standing stones at locations like Stonehenge could be considered a colonnade, or those at Avebury as a series of rudimentary columns. But returning to ancient Greece, Delphi has several monumental columns, the most famous perhaps the serpent column. This was built of several intertwining snakes, creating an 8-meter tall bronze tower. It was dedicated by the allied Greeks who defeated the Persian Empire at Plataea, and is inscribed with the name of every city who took part. Now, we might not consider this a column at all, rather a twisting monumental tripod, as it was designed to support a big golden cauldron, a much more normal dedication to the gods. Although this took pride of place as the closest dedication to the altar at Delphi, another monumental column was dedicated by the Naxians, a 10-meter tall column with a sphinx mounted on the top. Now with the Romans came monumental columns of a whole new order. Trajan's column at 35 meters tall started a trend of memorializing great victories with elaborate columns. The aim was not just to commemorate the event, but to depict what happened. Spiraling up the column was a long frieze showing his campaign in Dacia. It was positioned between two libraries which had viewing platforms, so you could come and have a look at the column from much higher up, and there was even a staircase on the inside, so you could go to the top and have a panoramic view of the city. The idea of great columns to commemorate people and events, or to show off a location's power and wealth, has never really gone away, but is something we can still see to this day. There were then an array of architectural orders and types of column that ancient peoples could employ, but we shouldn't put too much emphasis on this. Yes, there were some like Vitruvius who categorized types of column pedantically, but variation and experimentation was an important part of ancient work. Corinthian columns could have the leaves and flowers of local flora, rather than the acanthus, blending Roman and local identities. Some functional columns had more flexibility, such as the Medusa column in the Basilica Cisterns. And commemorative columns made it a point to be different, so they could stand out. Look at the twisting frieze of Trajan's column, the odd shape of the walled obelisk, or the uniqueness of the serpent column. Combinations could be strange and surprising, such as the never-finished temple of Olympian Zeus in Sicily. Unusually for a Greek temple, it had engaged columns and combined them with 7.5-meter tall atlases. The classical world loved using columns, and so it's only natural that they saw such variety. In time, the adherence to strict classical forms waned, and a huge variety of columns emerged. While they are still used across the world today in many different forms, we really are still learning from the masters. After all, the tallest load-bearing columns in the world are still those at Karnak in Egypt, built thousands of years ago.